Hi everyone, so my name is Esha and today me and my group are going to be presenting on gentrification and how it negatively impacts the education and the healthcare system in the US. So today I'm going to first be explaining what is gentrification, and then I'll go more in depth on how it can generally negatively impact the former residents that are living in these gentrifying neighborhoods. So first, gentrification is basically this process of changing the character of the underdeveloped neighborhood through increasing the population of middle and upper class residents and businesses. So what does this mean exactly? So in other words, there's these big corporations and they're tearing down a lot of these old apartment complexes and restaurants and businesses, and they're basically recreating them to make them look much more modern, much more expensive, and much more attractive and appealing to the eyes of individuals that come from middle class and even upper class backgrounds. And so ultimately, priority is going to be given to these wealthy outsiders, which means everything is done in order to please the newcomers rather than to hold on to the longtime residents. So as a result, the poor are going to be displaced from these neighborhoods because the property values are increasing, rent is increasing, and everything will just become way too expensive that they can't sustain this type of lifestyle. So does gentrification have any positive impacts? Some will argue and say that gentrification is beneficial since the process creates more development, rapid economic investment, and supportive projects related to consumption and entertainment. But that's not necessarily the case for most gentrified neighborhoods in the US, right? Like I've said before, tenants with lower incomes will no longer be able to afford living there. And there's going to become this fostering of discriminatory behavior by people in power. So for example, there's this development corporation in New York Chinatown, and basically they applied for this special zoning permit, and which basically just said that they could build a new apartment complex on this plot of land that controls renting with housing. And while the city was still trying to decide whether they wanted to issue this permit or not, the developer had already pushed out all of the residents and just demolished the entire building. And these residents, when they were asked like why they were pushed out, they said that they were forced to, they had no choice. They were threatened, whether it was by gang violence or by arson, or they weren't getting the services that they needed from the apartment complex. And as a result, they were pushed out of out of their homes, and they had to look for someplace else to live. And unfortunately, they couldn't do anything about it because they weren't the ones in power. The corporation was the one in power. And this is unfortunately a recurring pattern that is happening all throughout the United States. Also, it focuses on spaces that exclude low-income individuals and people of color. So this is specifically on elderly individuals, right? When elderly individuals are basically being forced out of their homes, they're losing the communication and the social network that they've already created. They've created all of these friendships and relationships in that apartment complex. And now that they're being forced to move into another area, into another apartment, they start becoming much more lonely and much more depressed as a result of being displaced. So in many of these gentrified neighborhoods, there's an urban planning shift, right? We've noticed that from there's a shift from fostering community formation to investing the city with money, because these big corporations, all they care about is money. They know that these individuals that come from low income backgrounds, they don't have the necessary money they need in order to continue living there. So they're forcing these individuals to move out because they want the money from people who are well off, people that come from middle class or even upper class backgrounds. So it's starting to turn into a city with money and consumption oriented spaces, right? That resemble suburban shopping malls that exclude low income and people of color. So, does gentrification have any positive impacts? Ultimately, no, gentrification doesn't have any positive impacts. And some people may argue and say, what about education, right? And in a way, education can have a positive impact on these low income children that come from these low income families because they will be positively influenced by children that come from better off families and be more encouraged to pursue higher education and to go off to college. Also, as a bonus in these gentrifying neighborhoods, the schools will start to become much more better too. They will start receiving grants from governments that will help to have resources and maybe even private tutors and all of these other additional factors that can help contribute to the children's education and to make them help them to pursue a higher education. But unfortunately, even though studies have shown that this is true, this just isn't feasible for a lot of these low income families because either way, they still can't afford to live in those areas. Prices are way too high. The rent is just not in their budget, and unfortunately they just have to move out of these neighborhoods and go and move into neighborhoods that are more low income and that don't have like the best schools and the best education for their children. So ultimately, we need more policies that value community input, that offer equitable rezoning policies and provide intentional housing options. We need to recognize how destructive gentrification really is so that we can convince our lawmakers to conjure up and to create policies that can remedy or even end the trends that cause forced displacement in the first place.
Gentrification versus education. In lower income neighborhoods, the property tax collected is substantially less than compared to higher income neighborhoods. What does this mean? Essentially, what this means is that in lower socioeconomic environments, there's less of a property tax that is able to be collected when compared to higher or more wealthier neighborhoods. The tax money can then be allocated to educational funds, and consequently, the wealthier towns will have a more privileged and higher quality of education, while the disparity between the towns only grows. Because the wealthier neighborhoods are able to have a greater amount of tax, they're able to allocate it more properly and be able to refine and their communities and allocate it to sources that they need. In gentrified neighborhoods, those who cannot afford to live there anymore are displaced and neglected by the public school system because they are no longer live in a town as the education quality slowly rises from additional financial support. As one can see, due to gentrification, it can impact education on a wide scale, especially for those in a lower socioeconomic environment or neighborhood. They're more prone to gentrification and also a lower quality of education. Gentrification versus healthcare in the United States. So not only can gentrification be viewed on in terms of education, but it can also be applied to regarding the healthcare system in the United States. So healthcare is often a representative of a shift in care geared toward the more wealthy. So what this means is that basically the wealthier neighborhoods are able to have access to a greater amount of healthcare facilities and address their healthcare needs. While lower socioeconomic environments and neighborhoods don't necessarily have proper health care and often are neglected. This favors the wealthier residents in comparison to the more vulnerable residents. So what this means is that basically because of these greater taxes, because of these gentrification, that they will only be able to properly address the healthcare systems in the more wealthier neighborhoods. It's more seen as a burden or a problem or issue in the lower socioeconomic environments. Because there is no money, it's difficult to address these healthcare needs in the more impoverished areas. This type of gentrification can also be considered both on a small scale and large scale. What this means is that ultimately gentrification can impact healthcare both minutely and very largely. It depends on how and what it's doing to the healthcare system. Where people live, work, and play often limits accessibility to proper healthcare and often leads to neglecting the poor. So yeah, as stated earlier, the poor residents in poor neighborhoods are at a disadvantage because they don't necessarily have access to proper healthcare facilities, and they don't have access to the healthcare system as much as the more wealthier areas. And because of gentrification, they could be neglected, and bodily issues or problems that are minute can be ultimately tend to grow into bigger and bigger problems and issues and metastasize throughout the body. And ultimately they don't still these residents may not ever have the ability to be able to address their address their health issues. So gentrification both does have some pros and cons, and we'll just go through that right now real quickly. So pros, what it can do is it could decrease the crime rates because they're trying to eliminate um, residents or more residents of lower with lower income. They may tend to decrease crime rates since essentially only residents that are making a wealthy amount of money are going to be able to remain or reside within the area. Also, they may provide more employment opportunities as they tend to make it more city-like from urban. Um, um, it could improve employment rate and also provide jobs for more middle class and more wealthier residents. And in addition, because there's now an organization to the neighborhood and there's some sort of management, the neighborhoods can become more cleaner and safer than they previously were. There's a less amounts of drugs and bad sanitation, etc., because of gentrification. But although gentrification has its pros, there could be several cons to it. One of the con that's very not good is includes that it can have an increase in property taxes. What this does is it causes eviction of residents to occur and hopeless rates to skyrocket. It can also change the culture of the neighborhood. So before, if there was a certain culture that marked that territory, the culture that ultimately dominated that territory, now because of gentrification, it can ultimately alter, change, and manipulate the culture of the neighborhood, since new residents with different socioeconomic backgrounds tend to migrate to the area when more individuals who are unaware of the previous culture tend to migrate to the area, and more wealthy residents with their own manners migrate to the area.
Hello, guys. I'm Maryam, and I'm here to give insights on how to combat or alleviate gentrification by giving access to quality education and healthcare for all. So, the creation of more magnet schools nationwide could help alleviate gentrification. For starters, magnet schools are public schools that offer special instruction and programs that are not available elsewhere. For example, science honors classes, and those are designed to attract a more diverse student body from throughout a school district. With magnet schools, those give minorities and people of color the ability to have higher education, which could give people of color and minorities a chance of having gaining social mobility and having a high income, and as a result that could get them out of the poverty threshold that gentrification strives to put minorities and people of color in. But for regular public neighborhood schools, um they lack the access of having higher education. So with that being said, those would stunt the chances of people of color and minorities of gaining social mobility and gaining higher income in the future. Hence, that could put them back into the poverty threshold that gentrification strives for people of color and minorities to be in. So, on top of that, magnet schools get funding from states and federal government. So that would make schools more affordable for low income families or people of color or minorities, since they're usually the ones that don't have a lot of money or a lot to give. But this creates a dilemma of better schooling, and raising the value of housing properties. So another thing that I feel that would alleviate gentrification is homestead exemptions. So homestead exemptions are tax breaks that are usually given to low income families or elderly, and those excuses those groups of people from paying taxes, and that could balance our unequal distribution of wealth throughout the United States. But the thing is that it makes it harder for government to balance budget, hence it forces government to impose property taxes on businesses and renters. Hence, I stress the importance of having um, homestead exemptions not for the houses, but for businesses and apartments.
Hi, my name is Nguyen. I'll be picking up from where Maryam left off on the homestead exemption. So what else can be offered are inclusion zones. So basically what these are counteracting exclusionary zones, which basically aimed at kind of kicking out lower income families from neighborhoods. Typically these were people of color, and this was done in order to raise the prices of the housing and target like higher income families. So what inclusionary zoning does is that it actually fractions off a portion of newer gentrified neighborhoods to be affordable to these low income housing families. But in an economic sense, this doesn't always work out too well, since it does raise the overall prices of housing by raising the demand, but also lowering the supply. This also negatively affects these lower income families, since a large number of them do have to move out since only a fraction are able to stay. But in cities like Washington, D.C., city planners have said that it has worked out well for them by creating a nice balance of both affordable housing and market rate housing, which does end up being beneficial to the municipality. Something else that can be done are offering more student run health clinics. These are also known as neighborhood health projects. Typically, medical school affiliated clinics are set up in a lot of urban neighborhoods where they provide easy, accessible, low maintenance care to a lot of the local residents. Um, this kind of counteracts the prices of university hospitals and private health offices. And with little to no copay, especially people with no health insurance, these third and fourth year medical students are able to um, help diagnose patient, provide accurate blood pressure readings, prescribe multivitamins, because these are all like a limited number of problems that they can solve. A lot of the larger problems and more complex ones, they can send the patients referrals to other hospitals, other public hospitals with more personalized health, such as MRIs, CAT scans, and surgery. And then lastly, we have our sources. Thank you so much for listening.